November 18, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The trees were already dead, stripped bare by artillery, their trunks splintered into white bone, their branches clawing at gray sky like the fingers of buried men. Private Friedrich Weber crouched in a foxhole filled with freezing mud, his hands so numb he could barely feel the Karabiner 98K rifle that was supposed to keep him alive. He was 19 years old, conscripted 6 months earlier from a Bavarian farm, thrown into a Wehrmacht uniform that hung loose on his malnourished frame, and sent to die in a forest that had already consumed 15,000 men. The Americans were coming. He could hear them moving through the shattered woods, calling to each other in voices that sounded impossibly young, impossibly alive. Friedrich had been taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, cowardly soldiers who would break at the first real resistance. He no longer believed anything he'd been taught. He believed only in the cold, the hunger, and the certainty that he would die in this miserable forest without ever understanding why. Then, through the skeletal trees, he saw the American soldier who would change everything. The Hürtgen Forest in late 1944 was hell-rendered in mud and splinters. Stretched along the German-Belgian border, it represented the Wehrmacht's last significant defensive line before the Rhine. The forest was a natural fortress, dense vegetation, rugged terrain, limited roads, perfect for defenders. The Americans needed to capture it to protect their southern flank before advancing into Germany proper. What should have been a 2-week operation turned into a 3-month meat grinder that would ultimately consume over 33,000 American casualties and cost Germany its final reserves of experienced troops. Friedrich Weber had arrived in October, part of the 275th Infantry Division, a hastily assembled unit of teenage conscripts, overage reservists, and convalescents returned from hospitals before their wounds had properly healed. They were issued outdated weapons, inadequate winter clothing, and orders to hold the line at all costs against an enemy that controlled the sky, possessed unlimited artillery ammunition, and could replace casualties faster than Germany could count its dead. The conditions were medieval. Soldiers on both sides lived in flooded foxholes, unable to build fires that would draw artillery, unable to evacuate wounded through forest trails that had become rivers of freezing mud. Trench foot was epidemic. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Shell shock left men catatonic, staring at nothing while battles raged around them. The forest canopy, even stripped of leaves, caused American artillery shells to airburst in the treetops, sending shrapnel and wood splinters down like horizontal rain. Men died from wounds that peacetime would have considered minor. Infections, exposure, simple inability to receive medical care in time. Friedrich's squad had started with 12 men. Within 2 weeks, 8 were dead or missing. The survivors moved through the forest like ghosts, too exhausted for fear, too numb for hope, simply existing between barrages and awaiting whatever came next. They had no communication with higher command. Their radio had been destroyed in the first week. They had no idea if the war was won or lost, if Berlin still stood, if their families still lived. They fought because stopping meant dying faster, because training and discipline outlasted ideology, because 19-year-old boys did what soldiers always do. They followed orders until orders stopped making sense. Then they improvised survival. The Americans called it the Death Factory. German soldiers called it Die Todesmühle, the death mill. Friedrich called it simply the forest, because naming it anything else gave it too much power. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Connor had landed at Normandy on D+3, fought through the hedgerows of France, marched in the Liberation Parade through Paris, and believed, truly believed, that the war would be over by Christmas. The Hürtgen Forest taught him differently. It taught him that war was not glory or liberation but industrial slaughter, that victory was measured in yards purchased with lives, that the difference between hero and corpse was often nothing more than which direction an 88mm shell tumbled through the air. O'Connor was 24 from South Boston, a machinist's son who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor with romantic notions of fighting fascism and saving Europe. France had complicated those notions. The Hürtgen Forest destroyed them entirely. He commanded a squad in the 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, so called for its red keystone insignia and its catastrophic casualty rates. They'd entered the forest with 194 men in the company. After 2 weeks, 63 remained combat effective. The Americans had every advantage except terrain and weather. They had air superiority rendered useless by the forest canopy and perpetual clouds. They had artillery superiority that turned the forest into a lunar landscape, but couldn't dislodge defenders from bunkers and foxholes. They had tank support that bogged down in mud and was ambushed on the few passable trails. They had supply lines that could deliver hot food and ammunition, but not fast enough to keep pace with consumption and casualties. What they didn't have was experience fighting in this particular kind of hell. The Germans had been retreating for 18 months, learning efficiency through desperation. They knew how to make every tree trunk a pillbox, every depression in the ground a firing position, every meter of forest cost blood to cross. They planted mines with diabolical creativity, rigged booby traps that killed medics and engineers, and fought with the calm professionalism of men who knew they were dying, but could still sell their lives expensively. O'Connor had stopped thinking about why they were fighting. He thought about keeping his men alive through the next hour, the next patrol, the next barrage. He thought about the letters he'd have to write to mothers and wives, explaining how their sons and husbands died bravely, when usually they'd just died suddenly, randomly, meaninglessly. He thought about home, about Boston winters that seemed warm compared to this frozen mud, about a future that felt increasingly hypothetical. He did not think about mercy. Mercy was a luxury for people who weren't trying to survive the Hurtgen forest. The encounter happened on the 18th of November, during a patrol through a sector the Americans had supposedly cleared 3 days earlier. O'Connor's squad was down to 7 men, moving carefully through shattered timber, checking bodies and foxholes for survivors or intelligence. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, the kind of silence that meant either everyone was dead or everyone was hiding. Friedrich saw them first. He'd been lying in his foxhole for 36 hours, playing dead during the American assault, too exhausted and terrified to retreat, hoping the war would simply move past him and leave him alive. He still had his rifle, but only 3 rounds of ammunition. He had no food, no water, and no idea where his unit had gone. He watched 7 American soldiers approach through the trees, weapons ready, professional and careful. He could have remained silent. They might have passed without checking his position. Just another muddy hole among thousands, another potential corpse in a forest full of death. But something broke inside him. Some combination of fear and surrender, and desperate need for the waiting to end. He raised his hands slowly above the foxhole's edge, empty palms showing, and spoke the only English words he knew. "I surrender. Please. I surrender." The Americans reacted with trained precision. Weapons up, shouted commands Friedrich didn't understand. Gestures that needed no translation. Climb out slowly, keep hands visible, don't make sudden movements. He complied, trembling from cold and terror, certain he was about to die but too broken to care anymore. He emerged from the foxhole covered in mud, skeletal from hunger, shaking uncontrollably. O'Connor saw a child in a Wehrmacht uniform, not a soldier, a terrified boy, maybe 17, maybe 19, too young for the gray in his eyes. The kid was trying to maintain military bearing, standing at attention despite shaking legs, awaiting execution or capture with the resigned dignity of someone who'd already died inside. Standing orders were clear. Secure prisoners, collect intelligence, move them to the rear for interrogation. But O'Connor also remembered standing orders about securing the forest, about limited German resistance, about the war being over by Christmas. Orders were written by people who weren't standing in freezing mud, looking at a kid who could have been anyone's younger brother. "Search him," O'Connor told his corporal. "Then get him a blanket. He's coming with us." The march back to American lines took 4 hours through terrain that tried to kill them with every step. Friedrich walked surrounded by soldiers who 48 hours earlier he'd been trying to kill, now sharing their canteens and cigarettes, treating him with business-like professionalism that felt surreal after years of propaganda about American brutality. They gave him a wool blanket, a chocolate bar that made him dizzy with sugar, and a warning through gestures. Don't run, don't make sudden moves, and he'd survive. O'Connor watched the prisoner carefully, not trusting, but not hostile. The kid stumbled with exhaustion, flinched at distant artillery, kept his eyes down in the universal posture of defeated soldiers everywhere. At one point he fell, too weak to continue. O'Connor's men looked at him questioningly. They could leave the prisoner, shoot him, or help him. Each option was justifiable under different interpretations of their orders. O'Connor made a decision that had no tactical value but somehow felt necessary. "Jenkins, give him some water. Anderson, help him up. We're not leaving anyone in this forest if we can help it." His men complied without comment. They'd learned to trust his judgment, and besides, none of them wanted to shoot a kid who'd already surrendered. They reached the American lines at dusk, delivered Friedrich to the military police processing station, and received instructions for their next patrol. O'Connor watched the prisoner being led away, hunched and defeated, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months: satisfaction at having saved a life instead of ending one. It was a small moment in an enormous war, meaningless statistically, but it felt like reclaiming some piece of humanity the Hürtgen Forest had been systematically destroying. Friedrich spent the night in a secured tent with 40 other prisoners, given hot soup and bread, treated for minor wounds and exposure by American medics who worked with efficient compassion. He couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the encounter endlessly, trying to understand why he was alive. In Wehrmacht training, they'd been taught that Americans executed prisoners, especially SS and Wehrmacht soldiers. He'd surrendered expecting death or torture, and instead received chocolate and blankets. His worldview, already cracked by months of defeat and propaganda disproven by reality, shattered completely. If the Americans were not monsters, if they treated enemies with basic human decency, then what else had been lies? What else had he believed without questioning? What had he been fighting for? Friedrich spent the remainder of the war in POW camps, first in Belgium, then France, finally England. The camps were run according to Geneva Convention standards: adequate food, medical care, shelter, recreational facilities, and systematic re-education programs designed to denazify prisoners and prepare them for democratic Germany. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German prisoners in Allied custody ate better than German civilians, received better medical care than German soldiers, and lived in greater safety than German cities being systematically reduced to rubble. The re-education was comprehensive and psychologically devastating. Allied authorities screened films from liberated concentration camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, documenting industrial genocide that made battlefield violence seem almost clean by comparison. Many prisoners claimed the footage was propaganda, special effects, Allied lies. Then the authorities brought in survivors, showed documents, presented evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. Friedrich watched and understood with horrible clarity that he'd been complicit in something monstrous. Not directly. He'd never served in camps, never participated in atrocities, had been conscripted too late for the worst crimes, but he'd worn the uniform, fought for the regime, accepted propaganda without questioning deeply enough. His innocence was personal but not absolute. Germany's crimes stained everyone who'd served, whether they'd pulled triggers in camps or merely held defensive lines, while genocide proceeded behind them. The psychological impact fractured prisoners along generational and ideological lines. Older soldiers, especially career Wehrmacht and committed Nazis, retreated into rigid denial or committed suicide. Younger conscripts like Friedrich, whose beliefs hadn't fully hardened before reality intervened, struggled toward acceptance and understanding. They formed discussion groups, studied Allied materials about democracy and human rights, and slowly rebuilt worldviews from rubble. Friedrich thought constantly about the American sergeant who'd spared him. That single act of mercy had saved his life, but it had also created an obligation to understand why he'd been shown compassion, to become worthy of survival, to build something better than what had been destroyed. He learned English voraciously, studied American and British political systems, and absorbed everything he could about the democratic societies that had defeated Germany militarily and were now trying to reconstruct it morally. In 1947, Friedrich was repatriated to what would become West Germany, a devastated nation under occupation, learning democracy at gunpoint, struggling to feed itself while confronting its historical crimes. He returned to his family's Bavarian farm, found his parents alive but aged beyond their years, and began the long work of rebuilding both land and soul. Michael O'Connor returned to Boston in December 1945, carrying wounds visible and invisible. Physically, he'd survived relatively intact: shrapnel scars, partial hearing loss, chronic pain from frostbite damage. Psychologically, he carried the Hürtgen Forest in nightmares that woke him sweating, in hypervigilance that made civilian life feel surreal, in survivor's guilt that asked endlessly why he'd lived when so many others hadn't. He tried to resume normal life. He returned to the machine shop, married his high school girlfriend Mary, bought a house in Dorchester with his GI Bill benefits, had 3 children. He attended VFW meetings, went to church, voted in elections, participated in the Great American Prosperity of the 1950s and 60s. Externally, he was the model veteran, stable, productive, successfully reintegrated. Internally, he was haunted by questions without comfortable answers. He'd killed men. How many? He couldn't say precisely, didn't want to calculate. He'd given orders that sent men to their deaths. He'd survived battles that killed friends and strangers with equal randomness. The war was called good. The cause was just. But the reality had been mud and blood and industrial slaughter that felt neither good nor just, merely necessary in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The German prisoner haunted him particularly. O'Connor didn't know the kid's name, didn't know if he'd survived the war, couldn't explain even to himself why that particular encounter mattered. He'd made similar decisions dozens of times. When to shoot, when to take prisoners, when to show mercy or ruthlessness. But something about that terrified teenager in the Hurtgen Forest represented a choice that felt morally significant, a moment when humanity had trumped military necessity. Mary noticed his brooding but didn't press. She'd learned that combat veterans carried things they couldn't share, that the best support was quiet presence rather than forced conversation. She watched him wake from nightmares, saw him flinch at sudden noises, noticed how he avoided fireworks and loud celebrations. She loved him patiently, understanding that part of him had never fully left Europe. O'Connor rarely spoke about the war, except with other veterans, and even then, in elliptical terms, dark humor, masking darker memories. He told his children sanitized stories, liberating France, seeing Paris, meeting interesting people. He didn't describe the Hurtgen Forest. He didn't explain that meeting interesting people often meant killing them or watching them die. He protected his family from truths that civilian life wasn't equipped to process. Friedrich Weber rebuilt his life with the same systematic determination that had kept him alive in the forest. He worked the family farm, married a teacher named Greta, who'd lost her own family in the bombing of Dresden, raised 2 children in the new Federal Republic of Germany that emerged from occupation. He watched his country transform with dizzying speed, from Nazi dictatorship to occupied territory to democratic ally, from ruins to Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle, from pariah nation to respected member of the Western Alliance. The transformation was practical and psychological. Germany rebuilt its cities with American Marshall Plan aid, established democratic institutions under Allied supervision, and confronted its historical crimes through education and memory. The generation that had fought the war struggled with guilt and denial. The generation that came after demanded accountability and understanding. Friedrich found himself between these impulses, too young to have been truly complicit, too involved to claim complete innocence, trying to build a better future while honestly confronting a terrible past. He became a teacher, specializing in history and English, determined to educate German youth differently than he'd been indoctrinated. He taught about democracy, human rights, the dangers of authoritarianism, and the historical crimes of the Nazi regime. His students called him Herr Weber and respected his quiet intensity, not knowing that his passion for democratic values came from having served a dictatorship and survived to regret it. The American sergeant remained in Friedrich's thoughts, an unsolved question, an unpaid debt. He didn't know the man's name, hadn't been conscious enough of details during his capture to remember faces or unit insignia. But he remembered the choice. Mercy when execution would have been easier, humanity when war rewarded ruthlessness. That memory became Friedrich's moral compass, a reminder that even in extreme circumstances, individual choices matter. In the 1970s and 80s, as Germany completed its rehabilitation and became America's key European ally, Friedrich followed news about American veterans with particular attention. He read books about World War II, watched documentaries, tried to understand the American perspective on battles he'd experienced from the other side. He learned about the Hurtgen Forest's American nickname, the Death Factory, and understood that both sides had suffered equally in that miserable campaign, that shared trauma could be a bridge between former enemies. But finding one specific sergeant who'd shown one moment of mercy to one anonymous German prisoner seemed impossible. The war had involved millions of soldiers, thousands of units, countless encounters. Without a name, unit designation, or physical description beyond American Sergeant, Boston accent, the search was hopeless. The breakthrough came in 1994, 50 years after the Hurtgen Forest, through a combination of coincidence and the newly emerging internet. Friedrich's grandson, Marcus, was studying computer science and helping his grandfather learn email and web browsing. Marcus discovered an online forum for World War II veterans, Americans, British, Germans, Russians, sharing memories, connecting after decades, finding closure through communication that Cold War divisions had previously prevented. Friedrich began reading obsessively, translating posts with dictionary and growing English fluency, searching for any mention of the 28th Infantry Division, the Hurtgen Forest, November 1944, prisoner captures. The forum was filled with stories, some heroic, some tragic, most mundane accounts of young men surviving terrible circumstances, but nothing matched his specific memory. Then, in October 1994, a post appeared that made Friedrich's heart stop. Looking for information about the Hurtgen Forest, November 18-20, 1944. I was with the 28th Infantry, captured several German prisoners during that period. Wondering if any German veterans remember the Bloody Bucket Division or want to talk about those days. I'm 74 now, trying to make peace with memories. Mike O'Connor, Boston. Friedrich read the post 3 times, translated it carefully, showed it to Greta with shaking hands. This might be him, he said. The details matched. Date, location, unit, act of capturing prisoners. The name meant nothing, but the geography and timeline were precise. After 50 years through digital networks that would have seemed like science fiction during the war, he'd possibly found the man who'd saved his life. He composed a response in careful English, revised it a dozen times, finally posted, Mr. O'Connor, I was German soldier, surrendered to American patrol Hurtgen Forest, November 18, 1944. I was 19 years old, very scared, very hungry. American sergeant gave me blanket and chocolate, treated me like human being, not enemy. This saved my life and changed my thinking about America and democracy. I have wanted to say thank you for 50 years. I don't know if you are the same sergeant, but if you are, please know that your kindness mattered. Friedrich Weber, Bavaria, Germany. He clicked send and waited, barely breathing, wondering if he'd found his sergeant or just another veteran with similar experiences, wondering if O'Connor would even remember one terrified German prisoner among dozens he'd captured, wondering if this was closure or just another disappointment in a lifetime of unanswered questions. Michael O'Connor sat in his study in Dorchester, reading Friedrich's message on his grandson Tommy's computer. Tommy had set him up with email and shown him the Veterans Forum, suggesting it might help him talk about things he'd never discussed with family. O'Connor had been skeptical. He was 74 years old, not comfortable with computers, suspicious of technology he didn't understand. But the forum had been revelation, connecting him with men who understood combat in ways his family never could. He read Friedrich's message 3 times, memory cascading backward 50 years. The Hurtgen Forest, November 18th. A terrified German kid in a foxhole so broken and defeated that mercy seemed more appropriate than violence. O'Connor remembered the encounter with crystalline clarity, not because it had been particularly dramatic, but because it had been one of the few moments in that campaign where he'd felt human rather than mechanized, where individual choice had mattered amid industrial slaughter. Tommy, he called to his grandson. How do I respond to this? They composed the reply together, Tommy typing while O'Connor dictated, old soldier and young programmer collaborating across generational and technological divides. Friedrich, I remember you. I remember that day. I remember thinking you looked like my younger brother, too young to die in that God-forsaken forest. I've thought about you over the years, wondered if you survived the war, hoped you made it home. I'm glad you did. I'm glad my decision to show mercy mattered. You don't owe me thanks. You survived because you were smart enough to surrender instead of fighting a war that was already lost. But I accept your gratitude and I offer my own. Thank you for reminding me that even in the worst circumstances, we stayed human. Would you like to talk more? I have questions about what happened to you, and I suspect you have questions for me. Mike O'Connor. He clicked send with Tommy's guidance, then sat back, overwhelmed by emotion he couldn't fully name. 50 years, half a century of carrying memories, wondering about consequences, trying to make sense of survival and loss, and the random chances that determined who lived and who died. And now, through technology that seemed magical, a conversation across former battle lines, between men who'd once been enemies, and might now become something else. The response came within hours. Friedrich had been waiting, hoping, barely able to function while anticipating O'Connor's reply. The correspondence began that night and continued daily. Two old men bridging continents and decades, unpacking trauma and understanding through careful English and patient translation. Over the following months, Friedrich and Michael exchanged hundreds of emails, each message peeling back layers of experience and revealing the war from opposing perspectives. They discovered parallel traumas. Both had nightmares about the Hurtgen Forest. Both felt survivor's guilt. Both struggled to explain combat to families who couldn't understand. Both carried the weight of having participated in industrial slaughter, regardless of which side they'd served. Friedrich described his capture, imprisonment, re-education, and the devastating moment when he'd seen concentration camp footage and understood Germany's crimes. He explained the psychological journey from indoctrinated soldier to democratic citizen, the decades of processing guilt and responsibility. He shared his work as a teacher, his commitment to ensuring German youth understood history honestly, his determination to build something better than what had been destroyed. Michael described the Hurtgen Forest campaign from the American perspective, the casualty rates, the tactical mistakes, the sense of fighting for nothing meaningful in a frozen forest that chewed up divisions and spat out broken men. He explained his nightmares, his survivor's guilt, his difficulty readjusting to civilian life. He shared that he'd never told his family about the German prisoner, that some experiences were too complex to share with people who hadn't been there. They compared notes on specific battles, cross-referencing memories to reconstruct events from both sides. They discussed the broader war. Friedrich admitted Germany had been wrong to start it. Michael acknowledged that victory had come at costs that haunted him still. They found unexpected common ground. Both believed the war had been necessary. Both regretted its brutality. Both felt that individual humanity mattered even amid systematic violence. In June 1995, Friedrich made a proposal that terrified and excited him equally. "Mike, I would like to meet you, in person, to shake your hand and say thank you face to face. Would you be willing to visit Germany? Or I could come to America. I am 70 years old now, and I don't want to die without meeting the man who saved my life and taught me about mercy." Michael discussed the idea with Mary, who encouraged him enthusiastically. His children were supportive. His grandson Tommy was excited by the internet-enabled reunion story. In September 1995, Michael and Mary O'Connor boarded a plane to Munich. Michael's first return to Germany since 1945, 50 years after he'd left it devastated and occupied. Friedrich and Greta met them at the airport, two elderly couples embracing like family, former enemies united by shared trauma and 50 years of waiting. The visit lasted 2 weeks and transformed both families. Friedrich drove Michael to the Hurtgen Forest, now peaceful and reforested, dotted with memorials to American and German dead. They walked through the battlefield together, identifying positions from faded memories, standing at the approximate location where they'd first encountered each other. The forest had healed physically but remained haunted psychologically. Both men felt the ghosts, remembered the cold, the fear, the randomness of survival. "I stood there," Friedrich pointed to a depression in the ground now covered in moss. "I thought about shooting, but I had only 3 bullets left. I thought about running, but I was too weak. So I surrendered, expecting to die, and instead you gave me chocolate." Michael studied the terrain, remembering tactical considerations 50 years old. "We were supposed to keep moving, not take prisoners that would slow us down. My corporal suggested leaving you, but you looked so young, so defeated. I couldn't do it. I'd already killed enough kids in that forest." They visited German military cemeteries, American memorials, museums documenting the campaign. They met with historians who were fascinated by their reunion, recorded their testimonies for research purposes, answered questions from students studying the war. Friedrich introduced Michael to his former students, who peppered the American veteran with questions about combat, democracy, reconciliation. The conversations were profound but also surprisingly normal. They discussed grandchildren, complained about aging, laughed about technology they didn't understand. Greta and Mary became fast friends, bonding over the shared experience of loving men who carried combat trauma. The families ate together, drank German beer and American bourbon, traded family photos, and made plans for future visits. On the final night at a dinner in the Weber home, Friedrich stood and gave a toast in careful English. 50 years ago, Mike showed me that enemies can be human, that mercy is not weakness, that democracy values individual lives even in war. He saved my life, but more importantly, He saved my soul. He showed me what kind of nation America was, and what kind of nation Germany could become. I spent 50 years looking for him because some debts must be paid. Mike, thank you. Thank you for my life, my family, my students, everything I've built. Thank you for teaching me that the best victory is turning enemies into friends. Michael raised his glass, tears in his eyes, and replied simply, Friedrich, you don't owe me anything, but I'm grateful we found each other. You remind me that war doesn't have to be the end of the story. The O'Connors returned to Boston changed, carrying photos and memories and email addresses, planning return visits. But the reunion's impact extended far beyond two families. Friedrich published an article in a German newspaper about the encounter, which was picked up by American media. Suddenly, the story of a German soldier searching 50 years to thank his American captor became international news, featured in newspapers, television programs, veteran magazines, historical documentaries. The story resonated because it offered something rare, a genuinely positive narrative about World War II reconciliation, proof that individual humanity could survive systematic violence, evidence that former enemies could become genuine friends. In the mid-1990s, as the 20th century wound down and World War II veterans aged into their 70s and 80s, there was growing hunger for redemption stories, for evidence that the war's trauma had produced something beyond destruction. Friedrich and Michael became minor celebrities in veteran communities. They gave joint interviews, spoke at schools and military ceremonies, participated in documentary films about the Hurtgen Forest. They appeared together at the 50th anniversary commemoration of VE Day, walking side by side through American and German memorial services, symbols of reconciliation that diplomats could only approximate. The impact on their families was equally profound. Michael's grandchildren, who'd known him as a quiet man who didn't discuss the war, suddenly understood him better. Friedrich's students, who'd learned about World War II academically, now grasped it personally through their teachers' lived experience. The reunion made history tangible, transformed abstract lessons about war and peace into human stories with faces and names. But the deepest impact was on Friedrich and Michael themselves. For Friedrich, finding O'Connor and expressing gratitude provided closure to 50 years of searching, resolution to a debt that had shaped his adult life. For Michael, Friedrich's survival and success validated the mercy he'd shown, proved that individual choices mattered even amid industrial slaughter, offered redemption for all the times he hadn't chosen mercy. They continued their friendship for 15 years, visiting annually, alternating between America and Germany, bringing families together for holidays and celebrations. They witnessed the Berlin Wall fall, Germany reunify, the Cold War end, the European Union form. They watched former enemies become allies, saw NATO expand to include former Warsaw Pact nations, and understood their personal reconciliation mirrored a broader historical transformation. They had survived war's worst and chosen peace's best, turning trauma into friendship, enmity into understanding. Michael O'Connor died in 2010 at age 89. Surrounded by family in his Dorchester home, his medals and commendations displayed on the wall alongside photos from his reunions with Friedrich. His obituary mentioned his combat service, his decades as a machinist, his family, and prominently featured the story of finding Friedrich Weber 50 years after sparing his life, a friendship that had become the defining narrative of his later years. Friedrich attended the funeral, traveling to Boston with his children and grandchildren, representing German gratitude for American mercy. He gave a eulogy that moved the church to tears. Mike taught me that enemies can become brothers, that mercy is strength, that individual choices matter even when history seems predetermined. He showed me America's true face, not the propaganda version, but the reality, a nation of ordinary people capable of extraordinary kindness. He saved my life in 1944. He enriched it immeasurably after 1994. I will miss my friend. Friedrich Weber died 4 years later in 2014, age 89, in the Bavarian farmhouse where he'd been born, surrounded by the family that existed only because an American sergeant had chosen mercy in a frozen forest 70 years earlier. His funeral was attended by American embassy representatives, former students, veterans from both nations, and 3 generations of Webers and O'Connors, who'd become extended family through their grandfather's friendship. The story has been documented in books, articles, documentary films, and classroom curricula. The Hurtgen Forest Museum displays photos of Friedrich and Michael standing together at the site of their encounter, former enemies united by shared trauma and mutual respect. Schools in Germany and America use their correspondence as teaching material about reconciliation, the human cost of war, and the possibility of redemption. Their friendship demonstrated something essential, that war's purpose is ultimately peace, that victory means nothing if it doesn't lead to reconciliation, that the highest honor soldiers can achieve is turning former enemies into friends. The greatest battles don't always happen on battlefields. Sometimes they happen in the decision to show mercy, to seek forgiveness, to build bridges across decades of separation and trauma. Friedrich waited 50 years to say thank you. Michael waited 50 years to learn that his mercy mattered. In the end, both men received something more valuable than gratitude or validation. They received friendship, understanding, and proof that humanity survives even war's worst attempts to destroy it.